For this year, 5784, this is the first class on the second book of the Torah, which is Sefer Shemot. We're not going to give an elaborate introduction other than to say the following. The Chafetz Chaim always has said that the phrase, look into the Torah because everything is in it, has a specific implication for us, the Jewish people, throughout history, and that is this: no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, if we open the weekly Torah section and we look at it and we give it thought, we will find messages that are tailor-made to us. And with the help of some work that Rabbi David Foreman and Aleph Beta did to contemporize some of their previous classes on the beginning of Shemot, that's going to give us a framework that we're going to try to do that here. And I want to begin by saying in my lifetime, this is the first protracted Jewish conflict going on. And we really have gone through 90 plus days of daily losses, and of course kicked off by an immense pogrom, the likes of which none of us have had personal experience with. And here we are, day after day. We're davening, hopefully with extra intention. We're empathizing, we're supporting. But the mystical thing that haunts us is, are we doing enough? What more should we be doing? How is it that we manage to properly connect ourselves to the events that are taking place now for the Jewish people, respond appropriately, and yet at the same time show a sense of patience, a sense of durability, a sense of trust that's appropriate for the Jewish people to have? So that's what I want to address. How do we manage? Some people manage by feeling God has abandoned the Jewish people. Our window of benevolence from God from the Holocaust has come to an end, and now we're back to the Middle Ages. Some people respond by saying we have to become a militant nation like other nations of the world, and we have to just set out to conquer and oppress. Some people think the response is revenge. I want to suggest something which is a little mysterious yet to me, but it seems to be spoken about in the Torah in very specific ways. And I'll tell you what the germ is for this class. The first time I went to the Holocaust Museum, the National United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., it was an overwhelming experience. At the end of the tour, at the end of experiencing different exhibits, and no one really sees the whole place in one fell swoop, they had set up, and I don't know if it's still there, a quiet area. They had some survivors speaking on a video screen. It was basically an opportunity to unwind and to catch your breath and not just walk out into the sunlight of Washington, D.C., as it was the day I was there, and try to put behind you what was really an assault on your whole sense of well-being and your whole sense of comfort living in the world. So I remember sitting there for a few minutes by myself. I remember hearing a woman speaking. I think she was speaking in Yiddish, and it was written out on the screen. And she was saying something remarkable to me. She said, I was in camps for more than 3 years, and a minute did not go by when I didn't feel that God was with me and by my side. And I thought to myself at first, that's something heroic. I don't know how she could maintain such an attitude, but wow, she did that. And then the second thing I thought of was, why did that work so well for her? Or how did that work so well for her? And that's sort of the backdrop of opening up the Torah this year, looking at the second book of the Torah, Shemot, which is called the Book of Redemption of the Jewish People by the Ramban, because it's not just about the Exodus, but it includes the enslavement of the Jewish people, the redemption by Hashem, the receiving of the Torah at Sinai, and ultimately the building of a tabernacle so that this relationship between the Jewish people could survive ups and downs and ruptures and repairs, which is only really possible when you have a temple that you could seek atonement, that you could walk close to God, and all these different things taking place. So that's the book we're looking at here. And I want to set a tone here, and we're going to go in fairly sequential order in the beginning. If you look at chapter 2, sentence 11, if you have a Chumash with you, that's great. I happen not to have a stone Chumash with me right now, so if somebody wants to unmute, if you have one, you want to call out the pages, that's great. But if you go to chapter 2, sentence 11, where are we up to? The Jewish people have been fully enslaved by Paro. They're suffering. Jewish boys have been thrown into the Nile River. Somehow Moshe was miraculously rescued by the very daughter of Paro. And now he's growing up in the house of Paro. An immense irony that we all have to acknowledge. And then you look at sentence 11. Vayhi bayamim hahem, it happened in those days. Moshe's growing up. He was Vayigdal Moshe. Moshe became big. Vayetze el echav, and he went out to his brothers. Vayar b'sivlosam, and he looked upon, he gazed at their tribulations, at their suffering. Okay, now first of all, it's a heroic thing for Moshe to do because he could have stayed comfortably in the palace. He could have ignored his connection to the Jewish people. But first of all, the fact that this was a growing experience by Yigdal Moshe, that Moshe grew up, I think it's an immensely basic, fundamental Jewish idea that the manner in which people grow ultimately is by connecting with others. Most fundamental connection is the establishment of a connection between children and parents, encoded into the 10 Commandments, showing respect, honor, love, connection, reverence for parents. That's a fundamental relationship, which is to be maintained at all times. But we know there's the relationship between husband and wife, between parents and their children, between siblings, and you grow out in concentric circles. And the larger a person's circle is, the bigger the person is deemed to be in Jewish life. And indeed, the method for growing, the definition of growing, is how many people are you connected to? And connected doesn't just mean that you can say hello, but how many people do you feel for? How many people are you concerned about? How many people are you ready to do for and to give to? And all that's the growth process. And there's a lot of proofs of this. It's a very interesting idea, but it's the fundamental notion that Rebbe Akiva has behind the idea that the fundamental principle of the Torah is love your neighbor as yourself, because that's what it means to become a bigger and bigger and bigger person. And indeed, when a person's only focused on themselves or a very small circle, that person can't also even be focused on God. That's why fundamental to having a proper connection with God is having a proper connection to parents, and then growing out that relationship with one's maturity, with one's growth and development, step by step. There's marriage, there's becoming a parent, there's becoming a member of a community, there's giving tzedakah, there's visiting the sick, there's comforting the people who are in mourning. All this process, these essential processes that the Torah describes as being the most highest forms of being a religious person. And that's the way it's described in the Mishnah we say every day. What is it that you have reward in this world and its future reward? What are things that are incalculable in terms of how much good they produce in the world? And of course, Torah studies part of it, which we're doing right now. And the other part of it all has to do with giving the corners of your field to the poor, with doing kindness, with helping people get married, with making peace amongst fellow people. That's what the Mishnah enumerates. So that's what growth means. And the Torah is laying that down in the beginning. But again, let's come back to our question here. So what was Moshe doing? So Rashi pinpoints it. Rashi says, Nosan Einov Velibo Liot Meitzar Alehem. Moshe dedicated his eyes and his heart to see clearly what was taking place. Now, there is a medrash that indicates that Moshe went to Paro as a prince and said, I'd like to be in charge of the enslaved Jewish people, with the idea of trying to mitigate their slavery, maybe trying to negotiate a release. He was pushed aside with that. He wouldn't be trusted with that. It could have blown his cover, who knows? But in any event, what you see here from the Torah is very directly that Moshe associated with and wanted to focus on what was going on. And Moshe did this for a specific reason. He did it as part of this idea of growing, this part of the idea of connecting. If my brothers, if my people are in pain, if they're being persecuted, in this case, if they're being enslaved, if they're suffering, for me to turn my back on that, for me to comfort myself with so many available entertainments that I have for myself and ignore what's taking place, would mean for me to shrink and become an ever smaller person. And therefore my obligation, my sense of growth, my sense of purpose and meaning at a minimum, is to let people know I understand and I know it's happening to them. If you think about it in so many ways, if you think about the mitzvah of visiting the sick, when I visit someone who's sick, I'm not a doctor. I can't come up with a prescription. I'm not looking at their chart and trying to problem solve what the diagnosis is and if they got it right or wrong. I'm simply showing solidarity with the person. And that's deemed to be a great thing. It's deemed to be something that alleviates the suffering of the person you're visiting. Just that sense of solidarity. And indeed, if you look at the end of chapter 2 in Shemot, and here we're getting into a very exciting moment. We're getting to the moment when things turn around. Starts on sentence 23 in chapter 2. It says, after many days, the king of Egypt died, and then the Jewish people truly started to suffer, and they cried out to God, and now their prayers reached God. God listened to their prayers and their suffering. Vayizkor Elokim et Brito, God remembered the covenant he had made with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then what's the concluding sentence? Sentence 25, Vayar Elokim et Bnei Yisrael, Vayeda Elokim. God saw the Jewish people, and God knew the Jewish people. And indeed, that's what God is going to tell Moshe at the burning bush when he starts the process of redemption, which this is the tipping point of the process of redemption. What Moshe has shown in the burning bush is that the bush is on fire and the voice of God speaks from the bush, because what God's communicating is, if the Jewish people are suffering, I'm with them in their suffering. I'm not oblivious. I'm not withdrawn. I haven't closed my window so that I don't hear their cries, but I'm completely tuned into what's going on. Again, a little bit, it's edgy to me. It's edgy to me because if God, who is all powerful, is so intimately aware of what's going on, why hasn't God done something about it already? Now we're reading the book of redemption of the Jewish people. We know that there's going to be fireworks and there's going to be plagues and there's going to be thunder and hail and a splitting of a sea, and the Jewish people are going to stand at Mount Sinai, and somehow each and every Jewish person is going to say, wow, all of these experiences have brought us to this moment and to this place, and we couldn't be who we are without having lived through every moment of it. Okay, but we're not at that point in the story yet. And at the end of chapter 2, the Torah seems to be telling us that something dramatic has just happened, in that the level of connection, intimacy, awareness, empathy that God is feeling for the Jewish people has just ratcheted up that much higher. And this is the process of redemption. So how can we explain this? Let's give at least some kind of framework of explanation. So I think number one, there's a sense when people are suffering to feel they're alone, they're abandoned, no one cares about me, no one even knows what I'm going through. So an awareness, if it can be accepted by the person who's suffering, that God is not only didn't just hear about it, he didn't just read about it in the newspaper, but God is close to me, close to me. You know, we have a thing that when you visit a sick person, you should be aware that God's presence is there, because if the person's sick, then God is drawing extra close to that person. And therefore, we have to act in a certain reverential way, because I'm not just visiting the person who's ill, but I'm, so to speak, visiting him together with God Almighty. Okay? That's a fundamental awareness. Perhaps that's what the lady who was speaking at the end of that tour of the Holocaust was referring to. She had that extreme sense that as difficult, as horrible, as much as she wanted to just pretend this never happened or wasn't even happening at the moment, she rather saw the sense that God is with me here. So that leads a person to feel I'm not abandoned. Not abandoned pushes a person in the direction of saying, if God is with me and I sense that, then it's not purposelessness, but rather there's meaning, there's purpose, and there will be consequences. And I don't mean consequences of revenge, although any student of Jewish history understands that the very people who have subjected the Jewish people throughout history almost immediately disappear from the scene of history. It's not like you can mess with the Jewish people and then walk away and say, okay, I've got something else on my mind. It hasn't worked that way. It didn't work that way for the Babylonians. It didn't work that way for the Persians. It didn't work that way for the Greeks. It didn't work that way for the Romans. It didn't work that way for the Nazis. And again, we haven't seen the final chapters of the moment of history we're in right now. And as much as it weighs upon us, you see people expressing an absolute confidence that the same experience will happen. You can only feel that way if you avoid any sense of abandonment, if you avoid any sense that, okay, I guess God has given up on us. I guess there is no hope. I guess the promises that the Torah made about the end of days, they seem further away than ever. And yet you see people who feel differently than that, feeling as though they must be closer than ever. So this is like a dynamic that the Torah is pointing us to that I want to point out. And now I want to emphasize this idea by using a dramatic exposition that Rabbi Foreman developed years ago, and then he's rethought currently on the Aleph Beta website. And he says like this: if you look at Moshe at the burning bush, what's his big issue there? His big issue with the burning bush is, he has a lot of reasons why he doesn't want to go. But basically, God lays out a plan. We're going to rescue the Jews. It's all going to be great. And Moshe says, they're not going to believe me. The Jewish people, how could they possibly believe me? So perhaps Moshe is dealing to an extent on the level we're talking about. Jewish people have been suffering for a couple hundred years. It's oppressive. I'm already 80 years old. 80 years ago, they were throwing babies into the Nile River. The Jewish people have seen atrocities, horrific things. Their spirits are broken. I'm going to come in and announce, okay, time for a fireworks show from God. Nobody's going to react. Nobody's going to respond. So the issue that Moshe presents that God's going to deal with at the burning bush is, no, the people will believe. The people are ready to believe. The people will, when you get there, you will see, this is the beginning of chapter 4 in Exodus, you will see that they'll believe. Moshe demurs again. So God says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you 3 signs, 3 otot. We mentioned this in the Haggadah pretty promisingly, pretty prominently. I'm going to give you 3 signs to show the Jewish people. We're at the beginning of chapter 4 in Exodus. They're not going to believe you. So Moshe says, I'll tell you a way to convince them. And what did we get here? We get the 3 signs that I think we're familiar with. I'll remind you of them. They can review the beginning of chapter 4. Drop your staff to the ground, it's going to turn into a snake. Moshe does so, and the snake terrorizes him. Moshe jumps back from the snake. God says, okay, grab the snake by the tail. He does that. The snake immediately turns back into a staff. Then God says, I'm going to give you a second thing. Put your hand into your jacket, within your clothing, takes it out. His hand is white as snow, symbolizing leprosy, symbolizing death, like as if the flesh has died. And he says, put your hand back in. He puts his hand back in, takes it out, and it's normal again. Third sign, Moshe is still not convinced. And God says actually about the third sign, he says something very, very specific. Sentence 9. God says, if they don't want to believe the first one and the second one, I'll give you another sign. And this one will be a clincher. You're going to take some water from the Nile River. You're going to throw it on the ground, and it turn to blood. No undoing of it here. That's what you're going to do. Moshe is convinced, okay, with these 3 signs, sounds like a deal. Moshe travels back to the Jewish people. We have a little intrigue there with the baby born and an angel almost killing Moshe. We get to the end of chapter 4, sentence 30, and lo and behold, Aaron explains to the Jewish people as Moshe's mouthpiece everything that God has told him. They do the signs, and sentence 31, Vaya'amein ha'am. The people believe. Now, is this belief perfect? I don't know, because it's not till the end of the splitting of the sea that we say, when we repeat every day, Vayosha Hashem Vayamahu, on that day God redeemed the Jewish people, chapter 14. And Vayaminu Bashem Moshe Ado. At that moment, the people had complete belief, and we sang a whole song to express our belief, and it's considered a high water mark in terms of the Jewish people. But let's look at it says in 31, a little bit. Vayamenam, the people believed. Vayishmu, and they heard. Hipokad Hashem et bnei Israel, that Hashem remembered the Jewish people. V'chi ro'ah et anyam, and that God had seen all of their suffering. So again, we come back to the same theme again. These are very dramatic highlights that never jumped out before like they do this year. And they jump out with this idea, so God knows, God's aware. God, when that child was just thrown into the Nile River capriciously and sunk into the water, and there was no accountability, there was no culpability, there was no evidence, there was no record, there was no jury, there was no judge, there was no way of even having a shred of proof. Nobody was videoing it. Hashem knew that. God, who could present these 3 signs to the Jewish people, knew all that. And that's what Rabbi Foreman goes on to explain very dramatically. I certainly recommend you look at an Aleph Beta, but to do it just a few moments. The sign with picking up water, the third sign, the clincher sign, and it turning into blood. Because until now, the Jewish people were enslaved, and they were the victim of these horrific sufferings, but it was all done in a way that there was no telltale evidence. There was no record. There was no truth and reconciliation. As far as they were concerned, what happened maybe randomly, maybe without meaning. I just happened to be the victim. I don't know why Pharaoh decided to hate the Jewish people. We were living here peacefully. Our great-great-grandfather Joseph saved the country. Everybody should have been indebted to him. He was treated like a hero his whole life. How could any of this have happened? I don't even know. And did it happen? And could I ever prove it? Will anybody believe me that it happened? So the clincher sign was exactly that. The clincher sign was, here's going to be the proof to uncover the great cover-up, to say, and to use very modern terminology, there's no context to explain this. There's no excuse. And yes, we know today you can show videotapes. You can post atrocities online and then deny they ever took place. You can always say, oh, that was somebody else. Or you can say in a very sophisticated way, well, there's a context, there's a history, you have to look back. And if you're the victim, if you're the sufferer, all that pushes deep below the surface to a sense of abandonment, meaninglessness of life. I'm a lost soul. There's nothing here that I could ever hang my life on. How could I ever rebuild my life? I don't care what miracles God's going to do. I don't care how much hail falls from heaven and how much darkness. And even, I don't even care how many firstborn of the Egyptian people die. And I don't care about the sea splitting. I still remain broken. So these signs, Rabbi Foreman explains, were to create a confrontation with the evil that was perpetrated. In a certain sense, it's the very essence of what people originally set out to do when they documented the Holocaust. You know, and in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, there's a quote from General Eisenhower, who was prosecuting a war and who had his focus was on defeating the Nazis. But the first time he entered a camp, he immediately instructed his army subordinates to begin documenting, filming, recording what they see here. He says, because it for sure will be denied. What does it mean it will be denied? First of all, obviously the perpetrators don't want to own up to the evil that they've done. But worse than that is we just want to go on to a future like this never really happened. Oh, you have some suffering to do. And if you think about the lives of so many Holocaust survivors who couldn't open their mouths, they couldn't talk about it. People weren't interested in hearing about it. Never even worse than that. There's the history with the Holocaust survivors who went to Israel. They were looked down upon. You should have fought. You could have done more. That's doubling down on the horror of the suffering that took place. So God's three signs were the Nile that seemed to have seamlessly absorbed the murder of so many Jewish babies. The scheme with the birthstone and the two midwives, which didn't work, but the scheme that Paro had that, yeah, you take the baby, immediately it'll die, you'll present it back to the mother, it's white, it was stillborn, there was no crime, there was no evil. Never, you know, I don't know, Jewish people have been having a lot of kids, they've been proliferating, all of a sudden, not going so well. Again, to be the victim of such a crime. And then ultimately going back to the first of the signs, and that has to do with the demeaning, the dehumanizing of the Jewish people. That has to do with the context. Paro also created a context. Paro, as it's described in chapter 1, he stood up amongst the Egyptian people and said, you know, these Jewish people, they're very cunning, they're very tricky. Could be a war. They're going to gang up against us. They're going to overthrow us. They're going to take over the land. They're going to leave the land. Nothing's going to happen to us. Completely fabricated accusations that are impossible to defend yourself against. And of course, we know that not only is that the history of anti-Semitism, that's practically the definition of anti-Semitism, of whatever fear, evil, whatever snake you want to imagine as threatening your future, you construe the Jewish people, you take the Jewish people and you throw them on the ground and you say, I don't have a person here. This is not a human being. This is a creepy crawling thing. The kind of things that the Nazis who were executed in Nuremberg said standing at the gallows, that the world will someday realize what a big favor we were doing for the world by eliminating the Jewish people. No one can survive an onslaught like this. No one can survive the dehumanization. No one can survive the sense of, did it really happen? Did it happen like this? Did it happen like that? What did you do? It's inexplicable. It is inexplicable. So the answer is solidarity. The answer is connection. The answer is empathy. The answer is each and every member of the Jewish people growing by taking upon themselves to daven properly, by comforting those people who are continuing day after day to suffer these losses, by writing letters to soldiers randomly that say, I salute you, you're a hero, you're protecting me, and I'm indebted to you for it. We're waiting for a redemption to come. But the Torah is teaching us something very profound here. That without us responding appropriately, by each person seeking a way to grow bigger by facing up to the daunting evil that's taking place and to the sophistication of denial and context and the celebration of what took place on October 7th. The fact that we all, and I don't want to go through the list, organizations that devote themselves to protesting and eliminating violence against women, all of a sudden have nothing to say. Nothing happened. There's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to debate. That's the world we're looking at. It's a world we've looked at many times. It's a world that we've responded to by the way some survivors did, that when they got a crust of bread in the camp, that they looked at and felt, I could probably make it another day with this. And they saw somebody who didn't have a crust of bread, they gave the other person a half. And they did so because the sense is that if God is with me even here, and there's purpose and there's meaning, and there is going to be a future, then let me do the right thing now. Let me be the big person. Let me be even more hungry through the night. But at least let this other person survive alongside of me. Let me acknowledge the other person's humanity. Let me show the other person that we're one people. Let me do my all before God to say, I acknowledge that as horrible as circumstances are, as difficult, as challenging, as uncomfortable as we are, as fearful as we may be, as rattled as we may be, we're going to grow through this experience by really caring for one another. And to an amazing extent, we're seeing that happen. And therefore, I think to an incontrovertible extent, we see a redemption coming. Amen. It should happen soon. And we should take these lessons to heart, act on them the best way we possibly can. And we should understand that this is the manner in which the Jewish people have survived until now. And this is the manner in which the Jewish people who do survive will survive yet again.